I want to bring in NBC's Mike Memoli at the United Nations. Raf Sanchez is in Israel. Peter Becker is New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. And Aaron David Miller is senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a longtime Middle East peace negotiator. So, Peter, I wonder what you made of the message Biden was sending there. And I wonder, especially with the part about where he talked about being more selfless, leaving before it's too late. What do you think other world leaders were making of it?
Yeah, I think it was an unusually personal reflection in this kind of speech. Presidents don't typically, give their own personal experiences or discuss them in front of the UN like that. But he decided to, address the elephant in the room. This is his last speech before the UN. He is on the way out. He wanted to have a capstone in some ways. He recited the things he considered to be his achievements. He talked about the way forward, that he won't be there to lead, but he'd like to leave behind for them to follow. And I think the point he made about stepping down away from power was a striking one, given that there were a number of people in that room, I presume, who probably have been in office a lot longer than him and are a lot less willing to give up power. That's a pretty common scenario around the world. He may also, of course, had somebody else more domestically in mind, his predecessor, who refused to give up power and instead tried to overturn the 2020 election to the point that there was violence on January 6th. So he had that message, I think, both abroad and here at home.
Yeah, I wonder, who knows, but I wonder, Aaron, if when he was talking about, serving the people, not the other way around, if he might have also been thinking of someone who's not yet in that room, and that is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
I'm sure that's true, but it's also worth pointing out that the autocracy democracy paradigm, which the president referred to during the campaign and throughout his presidency, was noticeably, in my judgment, missing from that. But yes, I think there was an intended message, perhaps. Although I think you'd have to read pretty much between the lines. I think it was Trump related more than Netanyahu related. I'll also point out that can't speak for everybody in that room, but of the 190 plus folks who were sitting there, I suspect that whatever criticism they have of the Biden administration, they're going to miss Joe Biden if the election goes in the other direction. And I think that was also a point I think that the president made by referring to this as an inflection point. The decisions that we make today are going to affect the future in fundamental and critical ways. And I think that's centered primarily around American leadership.
And Mike, we knew American leadership was going to be a topic, or the topic, I should probably say, of President Biden's speech today. How did he do you think, making that case, especially in light of the wars that are happening in the world?
Well, Chris, one of the other ways this speech was particularly personal was the president was able to talk about the length of his service, the length of his time on the world stage, 36 years as a senator, 8 as vice president, 4 now as president, to make the point that decade by decade, challenges that seemed insurmountable, problems that seemed unsolvable, have been able to be solved and have been managed because of the work of institutions like the United States, because of the hard work of diplomacy, because of the strengthening of the alliances that he is particularly proud of over the last 3 years. And so there is no problem that seems more impossible to solve right now than what we see in the Middle East. And the president also seemed to lay down a marker with that perspective about dealing with that crisis. Take a listen.
Full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. Even if the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible. In fact, it remains the only path to lasting security, to allow the residents from both countries to return to their homes and the border safely. And that's what we're working tirelessly to achieve.
The president there talking about the importance of diplomacy. We've also heard in the context of the situation in Lebanon right now that White House officials urging de-escalation, especially directing that message towards Israel. We heard the president seem to send a message to Prime Minister Netanyahu that de-escalating the situation there would allow us to focus more on the threat posed by Iran. He's sending these sort of coded messages to Prime Minister Netanyahu. But it's interesting, as we just saw the president's motorcade leave the UN here as he had other engagements this afternoon, There are no scheduled opportunities for President Biden to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu directly here on the sidelines of the UN. Perhaps that could change, but at this point, officials say there's nothing on the schedule.
So I wonder, Aaron, when you look at those things that Joe Biden has believed in for decades throughout his public life, diplomacy, alliances, institutions, if in this world where you have so much division, and I'm talking about internationally, but also in Congress, the relationship that he has with Benjamin Netanyahu, we could go on. If this is a situation where reality overcomes aspirations, where reality makes it impossible for the things that he would like to be true to really function in the way that they have perhaps in the past. Aaron, what do you think?
I'm sorry, that's me. You know, I got a sense from the president's speech, I'm quoting JFK now, Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. And frankly, I think that was the tenor of the president's remarks. There were some pretty hard truths there. I mean, Ukraine, a war that is clearly going to go on for years without comprehensive resolution. Situation between Israelis and Palestinians, even if you got a ceasefire in Gaza, you still face the intractable problem of what you could call the much too promised land, what to do about Israel's relations with the Palestinians. Moving on to Iran's putative request for a nuclear weapon. It's already a nuclear weapon special state. Then there's North Korea. And then, of course, there's managing the competition with China. So I think as you look out across the international stage, you see a world, Chris, to be managed, frankly, hopefully smartly, but not to be transformed. And I think the president didn't want to abandon hope. He referred to hope several times. Don't want to despair. Things can get better, he said. But I think he's also, at the end of his term, quite realistic about what can be achieved in the short term.